Hi, I'm John Moulis, and welcome to the second in my series of videos about life after the public service, life after the campaign of bullying and harassment that I had to put up with while I was in the public service. Now I'll start off continuing the story of how I managed to recover after the Department of Defence. 1 year at the Department of Defence, and even today, nearly 25 years later, I'm more than 25 years later, I'm still suffering the consequences to a certain extent of my period at Department of Defence. As I've mentioned in the series of videos about the Department of Defence, it was just relentless, non-stop, day after day, just high intensity harassment and bullying. And I told you about when I finished at Department of Defence. The next day I went to Department of Social Security and the CES, and I got put back onto the dole. Now, I had been on the dole in the period between when I finished at Department of Finance in early 1986 and when I started at Department of Defence in 1990, early June 1990. So I had a bit of a leg up there because I was able to go back onto the dole straight away without having to go through the formal procedure. I filled out a part form and I went on to unemployment benefits. Now it wasn't a bludge at all, because back then you had a government-owned employment agency called the CES, and it was an office there. You used to go in, they used to have people there helping you to get a job. They used to have job boards there. They had a board called Today's Jobs. You'd go in there as soon as it opened and you'd look at today's jobs, and you'd go to the counter there. Each person had a case manager who managed your case, and if they deemed you weren't doing enough to get a job, they would report to Social Security, and Social Security would cut off your dole. And I remember it was a cut off first, then ask questions later policy, that if your dole, if your unemployment benefit was cut off, you received a letter from the Department of Social Security, and then you had to go in and talk to them and show cause as to why you should be put back onto the dole. Now, there's been a lot of talk about dole bludgers. I mean, back then in the 1990s, 80s and 90s, the dole bludger thing was very strong, and it received wide currency in the media. You had whole radio shows based on bashing dole bludgers. There was a radio show on at night, the Stanzamanik radio show, where they spent almost all the time just slamming dole bludgers. And it's not like the shock jocks of today. I mean, the shock jocks of today are incredibly restrained when compared to Stanzamanik. I mean, Stanzamanik, he used to call his show Combat Radio, and it was just intense, and it became the by far the highest rating nighttime radio show in Australia. In fact, I think at one stage the Stanzamanik show was the #1 rating radio show in Australia, getting more ratings than even Alan Jones, John Laws or Neil Mitchell in Melbourne. It was incredibly popular, and I used to listen to that show because here in Canberra in the 1990s, the early 1990s, all our radio stations had music formats, and I used to like talk radio. I used to like current affairs and talk radio. I still do, actually. But anyway, about me being on the dole and unemployed from June 1991. I've always been a morning person. I don't like the idea of sleeping in. You hear about these dole bludgers nowadays sleeping in to about 10:30 in the morning, and then turning down jobs and all this sort of thing. I was exactly the opposite. I mean, I used to get up at 5:30 in the morning, even earlier, and go to the pool in the morning. The pool opened at 6 o'clock, a civic pool, and I used to get there at 6 o'clock to get a lane, because if you get there, because if you got there at about 10 past 6 or quarter past 6, all the lanes were full, and you had to swim in the same lane as about 3 or 4 other people. But if you got in there first and started your routine, it deterred other people who came in from swimming in your lane. And there at the pool, at Civic Pool, there was also a gym, a small gym there. I remember during that period, 1991 to 1995, or early 96, I was there every morning, and sometimes I'd be doing 46, 48 lanes up and down of a 50-metre pool. I'm not a fast swimmer. My swim stroke stings. I mean, I was constantly having the lifeguards coming up to me and telling me that, you know, you should sign up at the Aussie Masters to improve your swimming stroke. But, you know, it used to take me about 2 hours, 2.5 hours to do 48 laps of the pool. And then I'd have a shower, and then I'd go into the gym, a little gym there at Civic Pool, and I'd do weights there, and I'd meet a whole lot of people there. It was really good. It was really a golden era, that period. I mean, people look at the early 1990s and they see, oh, you know, the recession we had to have, Paul Keating, all that sort of thing. But I see it. I lived through that period, and despite the fact that I had this enormous debt of paying off the car while I was on the dole, I look at it as being a golden era. They were the best years of my life. I was 30, you know, in my early 30s by that stage, and I was in the prime of my life. Now, I of course, in my last video, I mentioned about how it took me about 2 months to recover, that I was in a total malaise. I was angry, disoriented about what they'd done to me at Department of Defence, and just really angry. And I told you about how I wrote to Patrick Brennan, the head of registry there at Department of Defence, who helped instigate much of this garbage that happened at me. And I wrote him a letter, you know, saying, you know, that I was on the dole, I had this debt. You know, I mean, this is essentially exactly the same thing I was saying to them while they were trying to sack me. I said, look, I've got this debt, I've got this car I've got to pay off, everything else, I've got rent I have to pay, I've got all of these things, and just the reaction there at Department of Defence was just indifference. They just didn't care, and the fact we were now in a recession, they just didn't care, they just didn't want to know. I mean, I remember Tony Cooper, the supervisor there in K Registry, when I said that to her, she said, oh, you know, she said, all of us have a mortgage to pay, all of us have to do these sort of things, that's why we have a job. You know, that was the attitude. They just dismissed my concern, and they were there running me out of the public service during the recession we had to have. And a lot of people forget that recession was the worst downturn in Australia since the Great Depression. It lasted 4 years. Some people say 3 years, others say 4 years. I remember the recession was officially over in April 1995, because that was when the statistics, the official statistics came out saying that Australia was officially out of recession. But people reckon that the recession actually ended, say, about late 1994. But it was still about 4 years. And people forget, during that recession, we had more than 1 million unemployed in Australia. You know, and we've never ever had 1 million unemployed before or since. You know, even today with a massively increased population since then. You know, we have about, I don't know, I think the latest figures said about 300,000 unemployed, but back then it was well over 1 million unemployed. And, you know, a lot of people dismiss the Keating government. They say, oh, Keating was an unpopular prime minister, all of this. But the simple fact is that the Keating government put in policies which got Australia out of the recession, and personally speaking, got me a job. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here, but what happened in late 1992, October 1992, I'd been out of Department of Defence for nearly 18 months. The recession was getting worse and worse. The unemployment rate was going up and up and up. I've been to countless interviews because, you know, you're case managed at the CES and you'd go for jobs, you'd go for job interviews and everything. And as soon as people heard my voice in the interview, they'd think, oh, you know, he's not the full quid. We don't want to put him on. And so I always bombed out whenever interviews were concerned. But what happened in late 1992, there was a job there at the CES on Today's Jobs for a trolley collector, shopping trolley collector. And I thought, oh, well, you know, I mean, shopping trolley collectors, how bad can that be? And the thing which attracted me to that job was the fact that I could work alone. I didn't have to work in an office situation. I didn't have little girls just out of school running off to bosses with petty, trivial complaints, everything. I'd be there by myself, working by myself. And so I went for this job. I had my resume there and, you know, in the folder with all my references, and I dressed up in my interview clothes with my, you know, boots and everything on, and a tie and everything, and I went down to Tuggeranong Hyperdome. There was a fellow named John Macready who ran it. What happened is that the trolley collectors weren't directly employed by the supermarkets at that stage. It was all contracted out, and John Macready was a fella from Queanbeyan. He was a security guard who ran his own business, Macready Enterprises it was called. And from the moment I met him, you know, a big guy, and, you know, he must have done weights or something. From the moment I met him, I thought, you know, this is a really nice bloke, and I got along really well with him. And so anyway, I went there and met him, and what happened is that one of this was at Tuggeranong Hyperdome in the car park down the bottom. And I went up to him, and he said to me, he said, "You're here for the job, aren't you?" And I said yes. And what happened at that time, the supervisor came in and said, "Such and such hasn't turned up for work again today." And then John Macready said to this supervisor, he said, "Phone him up and tell him he's sacked." And then John Macready looked at me and he said, "Do you still want the job?" And I said, "Well, yes." And he said, "Right, you're starting now." And, you know, I was in my interview clothes and everything, and I thought, oh, well, you know, start now and all that. And he said, "You finish work at 6:30. When you come into work tomorrow, I'll be here. I'll have the roster all drawn up with your name and the name of everybody else on it. And that's the situation." And so, you know, I did that first day down in the car park there at Tuggeranong Hyperdome with all this noise of shopping trolleys clanging, all of this sort of thing. And I remember at the end of the day, I went home and I could still hear that sound of shopping trolleys clanging in my ears all the time. And it took a while to get used to it, but I did really like it. It was physical work, and of course I was there at the gym. I was doing weights, I was doing swimming, everything. So it tied in with that. And after a while, I got moved to Coolaman Court at Western Creek. and that was great. It really was good. I was on the night shift. There was hardly any work to do, and I'd spend most of the time in my car, the Suzuki Swift, and I was listening to Stan Zemanek radio show and all that. I'd do a bit of work, and I got along well with all of the staff there. There was none of this personal politics, none of this public service, empire building and crawling to the boss, all this sort of thing. And it was really good. I mean, that year of 1993, because I started in October 1992, I worked the whole of 1993, and it was really good. That was, I would say that was the best job I ever had, and John McCready from Queanbeyan was the best boss I ever had in all the years I was working. It was just great, and I was getting money. I was being paid, I think, at that stage I was being paid $9 an hour or $10 an hour, which sounds really scungy by today's standards, but trolley collectors back then, that is what trolley collectors were paid, that sort of money. And John McCready, when I think about it, he really was a great employer, because the kids from school used to come up to him and say, do you have a job? And John would say to them, well, yes, do you want a job? And he would fit them into the roster, and he'd juggle the roster around and put them into the roster, and it was really great. And that was the first time, I think the only time, I'd ever worked with children. Well, you couldn't really call them children because there was a limit of 15 years old. You couldn't employ anybody under 15 years of age. So these were kids from the high schools, and the local high school, Western Creek High, which was still, and Holder High School. Back then you had two high schools within Western Creek. And there was a couple of kids from Melrose High in Pearce, which was my old school. There was a young guy called Matt who went to Melrose High, and I got along really well with him. I had an affinity with him because I was a Melrose old boy too, and we used to talk about Melrose and everything like that. It really was good, and the parents liked me. I mean, I was put in as supervisor at Coolman Court at Western, and the parents liked me because, I was fairly conservative. I was a steadying influence on them, and they thought that I was a good influence on their kids. But all of that came to a crushing halt in December 1993. What had happened is that John McCready had been hounded by the unions to try and bring in compulsory unionism. The Shoppies Union wanted to sign everybody up. McCready kept saying no. And so they kept taking him to the industrial court all the time. And finally, McCready did a deal with another union, the Federated Iron Workers Association. And I was given the job of signing everybody to the union. I had to go up to the kids and say, this is compulsory, you have to sign up and you have to pay union fees. And of course I was dead against that because I am totally anti-union, and I felt uncomfortable doing it. I didn't like doing it. And what happened, the parents were complaining to John McCready that I was bullying them, trying to get them to join this union. And John McCready had to sack me because of this. So, unions muscled into the place, and I lost my job out of it. And that's why I hate unions so much. I think they're an evil influence, that unions cost me my job. I mean, this myth about a union protects your job, that's BS, total BS as far as I was concerned. I mean, as soon as a union came into the place, I was sacked. And anyway, so that was 1992-93. And the first job I had after I left Department of Defence. Anyway, this is about to end, and I'll come back with another instalment in this series. Thank you and goodbye.